Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Evertill, a political science faculty member and democracy commitment coordinator at Moraine Valley, and I'm joined by my friends Darren Schreck and Mary Faflees Dunkel. And we are continuing our conversation about the 2024 election. It's been a little bit close to 2 weeks since we've last talked with each other. And I think that last 2 weeks has felt like a year with how many things have happened in the political world in this election season. So just kind of a recap, I believe, was it 2 weeks ago today? Today is Saturday, the 27th, that there was the assassination attempt on former President Trump. And, clearly there's a lot of unification around Donald Trump in light of that attack. And then a couple days after, I think it was, he picked on Monday, the 15th, he picked JD Vance as his running mate to be the vice president. This a week ago from tomorrow, this past Sunday, Joe Biden dropped out of the race. I think it was it Wednesday night of this week where he gave a speech. So Kamala Harris is the likely nominee for Democrats. No other Democrat has really thrown their hat in the ring. So there's a lot for us to talk about today. That's a quick overview of some of the recent events. We wanted to start off by talking about a little bit about JD Vance, what he brings to the ticket for the Republicans. There's been some kind of backlash, I guess, of this pick. So I thought I'd put that out there first and see what the two of you thought about JD Vance being added to the Republican ticket.
Do you want to go first, Darren?
Yeah, sure. What I have written down for about this was that I think the pick was to solidify the MAGA message for the future. That if Trump were to win, then you would have JD Vance for 4 years after that, or whomever. And but I also think too, his populist message was supposed to be in relation to Kamala Harris being on the stage with him, and that there would be this back and forth. And I think the Republican Party thought that this was going to be the dynamic. It was going to be Vance and Harris in that one-time debate that the vice presidential candidates usually have. Remember, too, that Trump wanted to have Doug Burgum and the governor of North Dakota to be the nominee, but Donald Trump's sons overruled it and said that, JD Vance would be the better pick. Now, I'll take from what David French said in the New York Times via Threads. A lot of the things that's been said by JD Vance in the past, maybe it's about women or cat ladies and single women and things like that. According to French, these are things that have been said by conservative talk show hosts and podcasts throughout the years. And the listeners of those shows agree with it. But now you have Vance's past coming out for the public at large to hear, and the public doesn't like it. So I don't think the Trump folks were looking at it from that perspective, but I know the Republican Party, based on what I have read, has looked at it and said that maybe there was a better pick out there.
Yeah, I think the three of us were discussing this before as well. Like, when we teach our students and we talk about how a vice presidential candidate is picked, it's usually because they're brought on for a reason, right? They're brought on to balance the ticket somehow. And I don't quite see, he's younger, but I found this pick kind of baffling because I don't really see what he brings to the table, how he helps Trump. I think maybe a female would have been perhaps a better choice. And again, it depends on the female. I think once Kristi Noem, I was gonna say she shot herself in the foot, but maybe that's a poor choice of words, given the poor dog. Forgot his name, or Spot, or whatever his name was. But yeah, I heard this is like sort of an idea of passing the torch on to this younger generation. But I find his arc rather interesting. I read, and I'm not sure if it was in the Atlantic or an article about him, if either one of you saw the same thing, about how he was one of his neighbors used to be friends with him who was trans. transitioned from assigned a male at birth, transitioned to female. And she said that he was like wonderful, that when she went through her surgery, one of her first surgeries, that he was bringing her food, bringing her soup, looking out for her. And this was like in 2019. So it wasn't like it was that long ago. And now he's, comparing trans people to pedophiles. So this just seems very disingenuous. This whole arc, like all of a sudden he just had this, this moment where he's suddenly this different person. It just seems very disingenuous. So I don't really buy it. He doesn't have much experience. He's a new senator. So I'm just kind of baffled as to what he really does for Trump. And his comments, as Darren said, I would echo that as well. The childless women things. I'm like, how are you going to bring who's going to hear that? And that's being thrown around all over the place. Who's going to hear that comment and say, "Oh, I think I'm going to vote for"? I mean, there's still going to be people who are going to do it, but if you're like a professional working woman, and I think that just not even just that, but it rankles people when you hear comments like that. Stay out of my business. If I don't have kids, you don't know why I don't have children. Why would you make comments like that? They're just unnecessary and just cruel. So here's a guy who a couple of years ago was bringing soup to his trans neighbor, and now is making these comments too. So it just doesn't seem true to me. And that's, yeah. So I don't see how he really helps him too much.
Right.
Oh, and I'm sorry, if I can say one more thing. Pardon me, Kevin. I did also watch on my new favorite podcast I'm listening to, the one with Katty Kay and Anthony Scaramucci. I forgot the name of it now. I'm already having a brain burp, but Scaramucci was saying that basically what he's hearing is that from people that he still knows within Trump insiders, that Trump did not like it at all at the convention when JD Vance was talking too much about himself. And you could see sort of in his body, and he's like, I know him very well. You could see in his body language how he was reacting. He's like, and that's not going to go over at all well. So the more he tries to get himself out there and make himself into a star, the worse that's going to be for him. Because, we see how it goes for, Trump's VPs.
Yeah. What I would just add to the comments, I think the speculation that I've read about was that out of all the VP picks, JD Vance was the one that would be selected if Trump thought he for sure was going to win, which, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I think all political observers would say was the safest bet, that Trump was going to win and likely win in a landslide. So there really wasn't much of a need to balance out the ticket. And instead, you've got kind of the person to carry the torch, so to speak, for the MAGA movement. And you've got somebody young, I think is got to provide more of the intellectual arguments for economic populism that directly targets white rural men without a college degree. I think if you were looking at it from a strategic standpoint, the way that Democrats have been able to, what's really key for the Democrats to win the presidential election in recent years, and by years, I'll say a couple decades, has been the blue wall. That's typically referred to as, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Trump was able to win those 3 states in 2016 narrowly by 78,000 votes, and then lost those 3 states in 2020, a couple of them fairly closely, especially Wisconsin. And so can somebody like JD Vance help bring out more rural white men? I mean, it's probably a little redundant. Trump does so well with that demographic already. So I agree that there's really not much of an expansion there. I guess the last thing I'll say about JD Vance, I don't know if this is the same person that we're referring to, but I know in the New York Times they had a profile piece of a former law school friend of JD Vance. And this person had just shared a bunch of text messages and emails of JD Vance, and calling Trump, racist and a horrible person. I don't want to misquote, but you can check it out in the New York Times today. But basically, signaling that he was JD Vance was happy that he was going to be in California in 2016, so that he wouldn't be faced with potentially voting for Hillary Clinton. So just again signaling something happened, and then also with this person was trans and very close. They were very close friends, and basically JD Vance kind of starts changing his tune on trans issues around 2019, 2017, can't remember the exact time period. You know, much to the dismay of this friend, and that friendship kind of blew up over that. And so there just seems to be a lot of political change. And I think JD Vance has said that change has happened because of him being a parent, in some of the ways that he's changed on some of these topics. So yeah, we'll see. I think I had sent to you in a text, I wouldn't be surprised, you know, if this continues to be a drag on Trump, if maybe in the next month or two that potentially JD gets replaced. We'll see where this goes. There's just, and kind of segueing to our next topic, there's so much momentum behind the Republicans in the last 2 weeks, and then to have it kind of flip in the last week, you know, we'll see if this is kind of a honeymoon period, but how does Trump maybe try to recapture that momentum, changing, you know, media attention? It could be replacing JD Vance. So we also were thinking about talking about the recent Biden address from this last Wednesday, and then we were going to talk about kind of enthusiasm and increased motivation that we've seen amongst Democrats for Kamala Harris. So Wednesday's address, what were your thoughts? Key takeaways? 11-minute speech, wasn't too long, but what did you think?
I'll go ahead. You know, I just found it to be a path to the future. I thought it was a really good speech. You kind of saw the age of the man in that speech as well, which, you know, you realize that it was the right thing for him to, you know, say that he wasn't running for re-election. But I find it to be a path to the future, not only for the country, but for the party. At the same time that the Republicans are in the third cycle of having Donald Trump as their nominee for president, the Democrats are looking to a younger generation, which is probably what they should have done after Barack Obama was done with his 2 terms. It's a historical speech to see a politician, a president, essentially retire in front of your eyes. I don't think we're ever going to see that again. He's basically retiring from public life. He had been in public service at the national level for 50 years. He listed all of his accomplishments, which was really cool to hear in an address, because I think during his campaign, no one was listening to any of the accomplishments that he made. I think I mentioned, and we all mentioned on previous podcasts, that he was mentioning these things during the campaign and nobody cared. And when you hear all of the accomplishments that have taken place in the last 4 years, it's my opinion, and I've said this, that presidential historians will look back on this, these 4 years, and probably rank Joe Biden in the top 15 of presidents of all time, maybe in the top 10, based on everything that's occurred in a short period of time. So I looked at it as, you know, a touching speech, a very presidential speech, and then also a political speech where you got to see what the party and what the country may look like for another 4, 8, 12 years down the line.
Yeah, Mary?
Yes, I would agree with everything that Darren said. I read somewhere that you could, that, you know, the hand of John Meacham was kind of help, you know, in that writing. I was sad, as I've told you guys before, I was sad for him to a degree, but I also agree that he's going to go down. History will judge him. Well, I've been saying that from the very beginning, if he would be willing to step aside. It's interesting that he was saying that he still thinks that he's the right person, that he's capable of doing the job, that he's accomplished so much, as Darren said, but he was willing to put his personal ambition aside for what is, you know, now, would he have done that if he had not been pressured to do so? Most likely not.
Oh.
But I think it's interesting and ironic that we are always having these conversations about age, and he brought this up in his speech, you know, that there is, with age does come some wisdom. And I've told you both before that one of the things that kind of rankles me about what I always hear, and this not even just in a political setting, but just in a setting in general, about people's bias towards age and against aging, and ageism is a very real thing. The idea, though, that the person that's really responsible for getting this thing done was 84 years old, and that's Nancy Pelosi. This probably would not have happened without Nancy Pelosi's hands in this. And I was telling you, I said, I kind of call her the Democratic consigliere, like from The Godfather. She's sort of the person that gets things done, right? So I don't know if she's putting a dead horse's head in anyone's bed, but either way, she got it done. And she's 84 years old. So the notion that it's simply a question of age, I think that's something that we need to be a little bit more discerning on. And then the last thing I was going to say was that I was saying to Darren, I think while you were gone for a second, Kevin, that, you know, I was talking to my sister, and she's a person that does not follow politics at all. But she was saying she was struck by Biden's tone and attitude and willingness to kind of put things aside and how conciliatory he is, even calling Trump for his, after he was the attempted assassination. And then when Biden announces he's not going to run again, Trump's reaction. And the contrast could not be any more stark between them. So I think this was a great speech, and I think it's going to be a speech that we are going to see in U.S. history textbooks moving forward.
Yeah, I think what I would add that's different, perhaps than what's already been shared, is he clearly reveres the office. Public service is very important to him. I think it is also clear. I was kind of expecting a little bit more about how he couldn't kind of multitask, like we were talking about on a couple of discussions ago about, you know, there's campaigning for the presidency and then there's being the president. And I thought he would give a little bit more focus about how he's going to put all this attention to being president, and that he wasn't able to do both. But I don't believe he thinks that. And I think that's important. I think he believes that he's stepping down to preserve party unity. And he was convinced that the Democrats were not going to win if he remained at the top of the ticket. And I think that not only for presidency, but for House and Senate. And so, but when you listen to his speech, I don't even know if he fully believes that that they would have lost if he would have stayed. But, you know, I think he was convinced maybe by Nancy Pelosi that, you know, we're going to do this the easy way or we're going to do this the hard way. And I think the deadline was essentially up for him. And it was going to become the hard way where people like Nancy Pelosi and others were going to be much more public. So, you know, I think I've been trying to say, I think it was long overdue, but it's still, just to contrast the two parties, I think it's unique for the Democrats in this moment that we're in for a party to put the party first and not the person first. You know, that the party's bigger. It's been a brand. I know that Biden's been around for 5 decades in politics, but these parties are much older than 5 decades. And you know, the purpose of parties is to organize to win elections, and then when in office, trying to organize to secure votes and to make policy. And so it's much bigger than one person, as Biden said. So the next topic I was thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, about the enthusiasm for Harris. And I thought I'd share a couple of things that have come up recently. Hopefully this works. The first one I wanted to share is the percentage of presidential candidates that have an share of unfavorable views by the public. This is from data from the Pew Research Center. And so this goes back from all the way until 1988. And so we kind of refer to this as double haters, where the public views both of these candidates in a negative light. And I remember the 2016 election being talked about of how these are the most two disliked candidates of all time. And but yet we surpassed that in 2024 with Trump and Biden, where 1 out of every 4 voters disliked both of the presidential candidates. And when we were speaking amongst ourselves on Wednesday, when I forgot to record this, it was mentioning that what a window of opportunity that is for Kamala Harris, because clearly people are dissatisfied. They don't want a rematch. They've been very clear about that. And so now there's an opening for Democrats to potentially capture some of the public who is unhappy. The other thing I wanted to share with some of the recent momentum that the Democrats have had This is from a website that is attempting to track all of the donations that go through Act Blue, which is the platform that Democrats use for presidential races, House, Senate, statewide races, a very, basically any political race related to Democrats. And it's not exact science here, but I think it's consistent across time, and it has tracked well with the actual donations that ended up being reported to the FEC. And what should stand out here is that at least over the last 13 weeks, I think it is, that the Democrats have been averaging about $49 million, $48.8 million per week. And then this last week, which isn't over yet, when we still have about 13 hours left in the day, but Democrats have already raised $241 million this week. So just a huge surge of momentum there. And then another one from YouGov, Ipsos, is that looking at net approval ratings, so both Biden, Trump, and Harris, all three of them, have more people who have an unfavorable view of them than a favorable view. But Biden's net unfavorability was almost minus 18. Trump's was about minus 9. And Harris's is just around minus 4 or so, but significantly trending upwards. So again, I think we had talked about before, not everybody knows her. I think 3/4 of Americans know who the Vice President of the United States is right now. And even those who know her by name, I don't know that they fully know her story. And so just a lot of potential there. The other thing I'll mention before I turn it over to you two is that according to Kamala Harris's campaign, 170,000 people have volunteered to join her campaign in the last 6 days. So just a lot of change and momentum for the Democratic Party. And it doesn't mean that she's going to win the election, but I think there's now a fighting chance. I think a lot of Democrats have more optimism than any of them could have expected a week ago. What do you two think?
Okay, so yeah, I think that's first of all, thank you for sharing all that information. I think that's great for those who are viewing this. As far as Kamala Harris goes, and we discussed this before, the three of us, 4 months in an election is a long time. I know we act like, because it drags on for so long, right? I mean, we all know that in the UK, an entire election is called for and held within 4 months. And we're just kind of getting into the last stretch here for the American election. So there's plenty of time, I agree with you, for her to redefine herself. Because I think that a lot of people have not known her, despite the fact that she's vice president. And in the last 6 months or so, 8 months or so, the last year or so, I think there's been a little bit more positivity around her. The negative ads are now starting, but I think that there's plenty of time for her to do this. I think she's already doing this. And are we already going into it? I'm sorry, sticking with these the ratings, because the Times Siena poll that just came out, was it yesterday or the day before? She was 46% to Trump's 47%, but that's up 6 points from where basically Biden was. So that in and of itself is a pretty big deal. That's pretty significant. So, we Democrats in particular, they love to fall in love, right? She's the shiny new penny, even though she's not really new, but she is kind of new. So I think this is a good thing. And this is a very good thing. I think there's plenty of time for her to redefine herself, and I think she's already doing it. And I think just the image, just the perception of having a younger face there, when so many people were saying for so long that they did not want to see the same election play out. I think that momentum, that boost has been tremendous for her.
I also look at it from the perspective that this is before the Democratic convention, all of this enthusiasm. And I see it in the poll numbers. So just yesterday, I saw a set of polls, mostly of swing states, where Trump was up 1 in Wisconsin, Michigan and Pennsylvania were even, and Minnesota, which I never really thought was a swing state. Minnesota, excuse me, is +3 for Harris. And New Hampshire has moved towards Harris, Maine towards Harris, and those were two states where Republicans thought they could make some inroads. And I find it that the enthusiasm is there because these numbers are coming up, and Harris is either ahead in some states or within the statistical margin of error, and we really haven't heard anything from her, like on a larger scale. So I think voters are willing to see and listen to somebody who is technically to them brand new to the political sphere. So I think that enthusiasm is going to carry forth even after the Democratic convention, but the numbers have to be, looking good for Harris, that she's either ahead or tied in most states. And this is before she takes to the larger media stage.
Right. Yeah, a couple of points on that. I think you're right about the momentum could just be the tip of the iceberg. I think that even, I don't know if any of us are social media experts, but there's definitely been a lot more momentum on that side of things. The TikTok and Mala being Brat and so many other things going. She's gaining a lot of attention with young people. Young people are signing up to volunteer. I think you're right to point out those, it was looking pretty bad for Democrats in places like Minnesota and places like New Hampshire. I mean, you don't want to be competing in those states. And on top of that, it looked like states like Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina were just out of the question. I think Biden was just thinking that he could somehow win it with the blue wall states that we referred to earlier, but that only works if you keep places like Nevada and New Hampshire. And that was sure, that those were going out of the Democratic side as well. So a couple things maybe on the negative side here. It's been a great week, or clearly with you're changing some of these polls by 6%. That's outstanding. But as we were mentioning before in a previous discussion, Democrats in 2020, I think Biden won by 4.4% in the popular vote. And it translated to winning the Electoral College barely, right? I think he won by 45,000 votes spread across Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. So Democrats probably need to win by 4 or 5% nationwide. And so if you're running even with Trump, don't celebrate too much. Yeah, I mean, it's great for Democrats to have made up that ground for them, but they have a long ways to go. And I think especially in battleground states that we've been mentioning, the blue wall states at least, how does Kamala Harris run in those states? We don't know who her vice presidential pick is yet. We'll talk about that next. But I think Trump's campaign will paint her as the San Francisco, California liberal that might be out of touch in these Midwestern states. So that's something to keep an eye on. Other thoughts with Harris and the momentum and maybe
building on what you just said about the San Francisco liberal thing, there was an ad that was put out either by Trump's team or a Trump PAC where it defines Harris as a San Francisco liberal who's out of touch with the public and out of touch with the country. And Francisco is spelled wrong 3 or 4 times throughout the entire. And maybe I'm looking at it from, that we're grading papers so much that we're always checking for spelling, but it's spelled wrong 3 or 4 times. And that's being put out there for people to see. And I think it goes to show you about how hasty things are kind of on the Republican side, but also how lazy things are as well. Yeah. That they thought this was going to be Trump versus Biden. And now they're just throwing things out there. And I'm waiting for the socialist, Marxist comments as well. And, I think when people are questioned as to what a Marxist is, they don't know what that actual term means. And they probably are thinking of either Groucho, Harpo, or Checo, and maybe Zeppo at the same time. But I'm waiting for those.
Joe Biden, Darren,
yeah, I'm waiting for those to come out too. Yeah.
And people who watch Turner Classic Movies like me.
Yeah, they might think that Biden was one of the Marx brothers at this point. So I mean, I'm just waiting for the old ad hominem attacks that are going to take place in the next 4 months.
Yeah.
I can't figure out why the Trump team, I can figure out, but I'm saying it shocks me that the Trump team was so shocked by this, that they were so caught off guard by this, that they were so secure that Biden was not going to drop out. And it's like, did you not see, these are political insider people. Like aren't they reading the writing on the wall? Like the three of us were pretty much like, yeah, he's going to drop out. I pretty much was, I know Kevin, you said at one point you weren't totally sure, but I was convinced once this all happened, I was like, he's going to go. He's going to go once they start putting, he's an institutionalist, once they start putting pressure on him. So are they're not interested at all in understanding the opponent to even know what he may or may not do? Maybe there's like a lack of introspection going on there. I don't know. But the other thing about Kamala Harris being too liberal, I don't know how many prosecutors are that liberal. They're not usually super and they're going to portray anyone from California as ultra liberal, but I would probably counter if I was them with Ronald Reagan was from California. He was the governor. There are ways to counter that argument. And to your other point, Kevin, that I wrote down, the guys on Pod Save America made a great point that on 11 a.m. last Sunday, Biden's people were planning his meetings or his campaign events for the week, and then by 1 p.m. they were Googling what green and brat and what does that mean and how to use that in the campaign. Just how quickly this turned around and has become the Harris campaign from the Biden campaign. That's pretty amazing for them to be able to do that quickly. So.
A couple other follow-ups is that the Trump campaign is also apparently going to use the prosecutor part of Kamala's background to try to kind of alienate her from African American communities, and so they're going to try to play it both ways. I mean, you're either a San Francisco liberal or you're the prosecutor. It's probably going to get confusing there if they're going both of those tracks, and then also. It's not, I know that Donald Trump gave a lot of donations, including to Hillary Clinton in her Senate run, but she also, Donald Trump gave I think a combined $6,000 to Kamala Harris, years ago, but while she was in California. And another point, it's been brought up, one of the questions that were posed to us was about third-party candidates, including Kennedy. And when we've been talking about a lot of these polls of being so close, all the ones that we just cited, you've got third-party candidates, including Kennedy, who by himself is getting 5%, sometimes more, upwards of 10% support in key battleground states like Michigan. What do you make of his campaign? What do you think that is his best days yet to come? What impact might he have on the race? Any kind of thoughts on third parties, including Kennedy?
All right. I'm going to make it clear right now. I voted for 3 presidential candidates who were third party candidates. Okay. First person I ever voted for was Ross Perot. I also voted for Ralph Nader. I also voted for Gary Johnson. And in all of those cases, and I'll even say the political geek in me, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I thought it was really cool that John Anderson ran for president in 1980. And I was like 5 or 6. The thing about third party candidates is as you get closer and closer to election day, they kind of fade away. And I think the Robert Kennedy Jr. campaign, if you want to even call it that, I think is already fading from the public eye. You might say, as Kevin mentioned, that he has 5 or 8% in the polls. I think those numbers are going to drop as you get closer and closer, as they typically do. I don't even know where he's qualified to get on the ballot. The one thing that I do think could happen with Kennedy is that he may gain ballot access through the help of pro-Trump groups who want to have an extra voice on that ballot. So perhaps the vote splits in many different directions. Instead of it going to Harris, it goes to a third party candidate in a state like Michigan. 1 or 2% could decide the presidential race in that state. But typically, like I said, I don't find it to be not necessarily worth talking about, but I don't find any momentum taking place on the Kennedy side. And I think, then his numbers are going to begin to drop as we get closer and closer to November.
Yeah, I would agree with Darren. And also, I think it was in that same time Siena poll that showed that the polling's beginning to show that with RFK in the race, it seems almost like he's siphoning off voters from Trump more. And because the poll showed that with RFK Jr. in the race, that Kamala was then up by a percentage point over Trump. And again, these are, all within the margin of error, small, but still, I think I would agree that that's reflecting that there's change. People love to get enamored with a third party candidate. And then when push comes to shove, they realize we continue with this binary choice. So I would agree. I don't see his candidacy continuing, especially I think that now that Kamala Harris has this change, which is so drastic and so just not a normal thing that you see in American politics these days, I think has really kind of captured the public imagination and will continue to do so. And the more I think that continues, I think the more you're going to see people deflecting. They said that this is the highest amount of young people I just heard that have not. Am I repeating what you said, or did I just read this? Donated to her campaign and are actually volunteering to help at a super high rate.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been amazing to see in the last week of the kind of turnaround. I mean, some of those polls, it's just historically, when I say historically, at least in the last 20 years, go back to the Obama campaign in 2008, Obama's getting almost 70% of the voters who are 18 to 29. Democrats really count on that demographic, as well as African Americans, Latinos, and to see the small gap between Trump and Biden with 18 to 29-year-olds. I think at one point it got to like 4 or 5%, something like that between the two. And now that's changed. So you're right. There's been a kind of, I think where Kamala's gaining is young people, African Americans, Latinos. I think she might be losing some of the support that Biden was able to get maybe in older communities, suburban communities, white people. So she might get a little shrinkage there. And I think some people, I can't remember who it was in the New York Times that was speculating that could be harmful for her in the battleground states because of just the way the demographics skew. And Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania being disproportionately white and without a college degree compared to the nation's demographics.
Right. Which is a good segue.
Yes.
To your next question.
The next question, which is VP candidates. And I think there is a list of maybe 12 people that Kamala is considering, but I think the smart bet is there's probably around 3. And in the version that we recorded the other day, Darren, I think you had a overview of those 3. So do you want to start us off?
I actually added 2 more. I don't know what happened there, but I added 2 more to it. I still think it's the major ones of the 5 that I have. Shapiro from Pennsylvania, and Kelly from Arizona, and then Cooper from North Carolina, and those are my top 3. And then Bashir from Kentucky, and then my wild card is from the administration itself. Pete Buttigieg would be the 5th one. I know, Mary, you were going to like that one. So those are my 5. If I were to pick of those 5, I would say Shapiro and Kelly. Both have electoral vote, prospects behind them. Shapiro, I've always liked Shapiro from Pennsylvania, to be honest with you. But I also think Kelly can get that Arizona vote. And the McCain family came out and said that if Kelly were the nominee, he definitely will go Republican. Definitely would go Democrat. So she has a big bench to choose from. That's for sure.
Yes, I would agree with all that. I think one thing I was telling the 2 of you on Wednesday was just that I agree with Josh Shapiro, although my concern would be his stance on Israel, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and rather close ties. And now how much would that affect the race? But it might affect it in Michigan. And these are the states that we're trying to get these, if you're the Democratic Party, you're trying to get these voters back. Mark Kelly, I would agree. He's the son of police officers. He's an astronaut. I realize there's an election in 2026 coming up, but I would say let's worry about 2026 further down the road, I would be looking at him as I think he probably be my number one. Of course, you both know, my number one truly in my heart is Mayor Pete. And this is the thing. I know that Mayor Pete does not bring, he's from Indiana, so he does know how to speak to voters in those states. He's won in a red state, as mayor. And he's referred to as like the Fox News whisperer because he goes on all these networks and he has zero problem talking to anybody. And he does it in such a benign way. He is one of the most fantastic campaigners out there and one of the best voices. So if you turn him loose on the campaign trail, as her VP pick, I even though I think that he's more of a wild card and he's, I think he's not probably the choice they're going to go with, but if that was my wild card pick, it would be Mayor Pete as well, because I think that he is a phenomenal campaigner and I think that he would do her nothing but good. Now, would the country, I was discussing this with a friend of mine who was saying, well, the idea that we have a candidate who is female and Asian, Black, and then we have a vice president who is openly gay. Would the country ever embrace that? I mean, they were saying that in 2008 about Barack Obama. The country's not ready for this. The country's not ready for this. And I think the Democratic Party has been bold in some of these choices. And I think, I would not underestimate the two of them as a team together.
I'm going to struggle to come up with something new because I agree with everything that you just said. It'll be interesting to see. I think the speculation is that maybe by August 7th that she'll name the VP, but all of the people, well, I haven't heard a whole lot from Roy Moore. Do I have the name right? From North Carolina. But the other four have all been very, vocal going out.
Yeah, it's
Wes
Cooper.
Moore.
Not
What
Roy
you're thinking,
Moore.
Wes Moore in
Yeah.
Maryland.
And Roy Moore was
Cooper.
somebody completely different out of Alabama, which we're not going to get into.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right. I knew I had that. Neither one of you were fact checking me. I'm just going to start saying some things that are untrue. But, Buttigieg and Bashir, Kelly, and Shapiro are all giving speeches and kind of being her surrogates, if you will. I've heard, though, that now I'm going to mingle this again, but North Carolina, it's Cooper. Yeah, that they have a good friendship, Kamala and him. So, she really wants there to be chemistry. Apparently, that's important to her. Trust is important to her. So I would put Cooper fifth on my list of the five that you mentioned, Darren. There is that argument that, North Carolina is a swing state. I feel like it's kind of that unicorn that you got to be careful to keep trying to go after this thing that you think is attainable that really isn't, and focus on the blue wall. And so for that reason, I had like Shapiro. I do really agree with Mary, though. I think that there is that potential to really reopen the wounds of so many Palestinian Americans, people who are very concerned with what's going on in Gaza, which is a huge part of the Democratic Party. That being said, there is the thing I would say on his behalf is there was a poll cited in the New York Times that Shapiro had the support of 3 in 10 Pennsylvania voters who voted for Donald Trump, which is really an asset, I would say, for the Democrats to have somebody who's so appealing to potential Donald Trump voters. And when I was reading something today where it said if you just listen to Shapiro, he sounds a lot like Obama in his speeches. Like sometimes even their voice and the way that they talk and the type of language that they use. So he's got a lot of upside. I think he's got to be a rising star in the Democratic Party. But I think if I had my guess, I'd guess it would be Kelly, for the reasons that Mary mentioned earlier. Also he was kind of he married to Gabby Giffords. If you don't know, Gabby Giffords was shot in the head and political violence. And so it's a very compelling story. Everything about his biography is probably just, it's almost Hollywood made, like a movie. But in that time, he's been in the background to Gabby Giffords, who was a House of Representative. He was, he was in the shadows. He was, not upstaging her. And there is something that might be appealing to Kamala to have a vice presidential candidate that way. And I think he also, one of the liabilities for Democrats and Kamala Harris is immigration. And he has kind of a different tack than many Democrats on immigration. He lives, as a senator from a border state, very highly impacted by immigration, believes in border wall and kind of change, it doesn't quite have the same stance as many other Democrats. And he's known as like an expert kind of nerd, if you will. And so I think there's a lot of upside that he might have, but he may not be the best speech giver. He might be, maybe not as, how's he gonna be in this vice presidential role? Before I move on to the last topic about whether it was democratic, if you will, pro-democracy to have this kind of last minute change to the Democratic ticket. Any other thoughts on VP selections?
Just read something on Bloomberg that Democrats in the know have said that the short list are 3 people: Mark Kelly from Arizona, Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, and I'll give you this third one, which we never brought up, and maybe we'll talk about it at some other point. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is the third one, and he's been making the rounds in the media for the last couple of weeks as well. So that's a third one.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this is the election where we start to bring people back from this polarization. I think the idea of a centrist Democrat really appeals to me personally because I'm a moderate, or I consider myself to be a moderate person. The idea of Mark Kelly, who is an unabashed gun owner, but also advocates for gun responsibility especially after what happened to his wife. I like that. And I think that in terms of law and order, the argument that they're already trying to use against Kamala Harris in terms of like what you were saying before, Kevin, about using against Black voters, her time as a prosecutor. This is not 2020 anymore. This is more of I think the pendulum is swinging a little bit differently. And I think that this is more of a law and order type election than we were seeing in 2020. So I think it's a big deal. And I thought it was interesting, going back to the Israeli-Palestinian point that you made, Kevin, that Kamala Harris won. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, was just here and gave a speech to Congress that was a very interesting speech. That her tone or her tenor was, while very pro-Israel, it was much less enthusiastic towards Bibi than Joe Biden has always been, and certainly that of Trump. And I think that's interesting. I think it's her stepdaughter is also a very unabashed, who is Jewish herself, but is a very unabashed supporter of Palestine, or of Palestinian, of the 2-state solution. So I think there's some interesting things at work here, interesting dynamics in this VP pick that might affect it. So I'm really curious to see how she's going to go after the Palestinian Gaza issue, because I think she's been very much more outspoken about the number of casualties and children being killed, and much more, what's what I'm looking for, much more upfront and much more bold about it than I think Biden has been.
Yeah, well said. So last topic, just share my screen here to kind of see if this works. Share my screen to hit upon this point. This is from the New York Times the other day, the July 24th. The number of Republicans, 65 of which who said that Biden withdrawing was a coup or amounted to a kind of election interference. That 14 million people had voted for Biden, and then they're rigging their own election. Thoughts on whether this was democratic or not. And when I'm saying democratic, like pro-democracy, and it's confusing when you have the Democratic Party, but Democrats have talked a lot about how this election is important because this democracy is at stake. And they keep criticizing Trump, of course, for 2020 and trying to overturn the election. But here, Republicans are saying, you've got double standards because you had a primary and nomination, you had a nomination process where voters, 14 million of them weighed in, selected Biden, and then now party leaders are essentially changing, going to a new leader without direct input from the voters. So what do you make of that argument?
Darren, if I go first?
Yeah, you can go.
I was just going to say my answer is pretty short on this. I think they're grasping at straws because they're kind of panicking. And number two, she was on the ticket. She was on the ticket with Joe Biden. So it's not like there's been no democratic process here in terms of putting her at the top of the ticket. Granted, she wasn't on there as president, but she was on there as vice president. So if they brought her out of nowhere and she wasn't on there, it might be a different story. But I think this is just, they're panicking because they weren't expecting this and they're grasping at straws.
Yeah, it's mostly coming from the Republican side about, how the system, everything with elections now is rigged or that it's fraudulent. And at some point, that's going to wear thin. And it's already wearing thin with me. I think it wore thin 4 years ago as well. That as soon as you don't like the result of something, you just come out and say that it's rigged.
Mm-hmm.
What if Biden had died? We'd have a process where we'd have to figure out who was going to replace him. And that would be even more chaotic because you wouldn't even have a name being thrown out there by the person who was by the president himself, because he would have passed away. So we're looking at something saying, so he stepped down. And as Mary pointed out, Harris was already on the ticket. So there's really no problem with it. If you voted for Biden, you really voted for the Biden-Harris ticket. So you get one, you get the other.
Yeah, I just would add, this was also a sign of democracy that, a New York Times Siena poll shows that over 80% of voters are happy that Biden dropped out. And I think it was, where Nancy Pelosi wasn't trying to push Biden out for no reason. She was trying to push him out because Democratic voters were no longer comfortable with him at the top of the ticket. And so this was kind of a sign of elites, the party leaders, if you will, being responsive to the voters who were contacting them, or looking at public opinion polls and seeing how unpopular Joe Biden was. I think there was just this idea that somehow once the election season kicked in full effect, that Biden was going to have increasing approval ratings. That just never happened. And so the other thing I was just throwing there and you two are more the historians than me, but it's relatively new, about 50 years old, where we have such a role for the citizens in primaries and caucuses. And historically, party elites, insiders would pick the presidential candidate. And the reason for that is they arguably knew these candidates better. And then also they have a lot at stake themselves. When you have a really popular candidate at the top of the ticket, they're going to bring out a lot of new voters. And then this helps everybody, for governor's races, House races, Senate races, and all the way down the line. And so, historically, these races would really, the party elites would pick them late August, and September and October, you'd have a kind of a 2-month race. And so this isn't all that different for those reasons. So yeah, I do think that those criticisms ring hollow. So any final thoughts in this session that we have today?
No, my final thought is I'm just glad that this is being recorded. I thought this was a really good one.
But it should be recorded.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's recorded.
Fingers crossed.
Either way, it gave us a chance to express our thoughts the first time and now kind of come back the second time, and we were even more on the ball. Yeah, hopefully. Right. I think this is exciting. I mean, I the nerd in me, this is like, I don't know how the two of you feel, but this is like catnip. This is all so exciting and fresh, and it's great to see something new. Pardon me?
It's a lot of fun. Yeah,
it's just, and it's, again, I'm kind of nerding out on all this because it's great to see. I agree with your point, Kevin, about this is democracy in action. And it's nice to see it's not just a coronation. I mean, it's like she made a point, Kamala Harris made a point of saying, I want to earn your nomination. Acknowledging the fact that there are people that are kind of voicing these concerns, but that she wants to be he perceived as earning the nomination, which I think is a good thing. So I think it's nice to see that this is just not a foregone conclusion. Like, this is now her being on the ticket, but I'm saying what we thought was going to be the case is not the foregone conclusion that we thought it was. So I think it's just exciting.
Right. There's been, I think it's a great uptick in interest in politics and the election. I don't want to misquote the number, but I think there's been over 100,000 people who have registered to vote in the last 6 days, which is records for, the number of people who have registered to vote in that kind of a time period. And you're right, for us, political junkies, this is just, there's been no time period like this, right? So, well, I appreciate you volunteering your time again and looking forward to talking to you next week. Bye.
I thought I would do my cat thing for, JD Vance's cat lady, make my little, thanks guys.
Hey, thanks, Kevin.